Thank you again for coming, and to Rita for all her hard work organising this, and to the Dharma Civilization Foundation and USC for hosting this event, which is, I'm very pleased to see this kind of this amount of kind of gravity towards Hindu studies happening at USC. Okay, so we're gonna have a slightly more formal panels of talks now. We're gonna have 4 talks a panel. The panelists have 30 minutes each, and they can use that how they want. They can talk longer and have less Q&A, or they can talk for they can kind of like talk for a bit shorter and have more questions and answers. So that's how this is going to work. And so first up is Professor Jeffery Long. He's a professor of religion at Elizabethtown College in Pennsylvania, where he's taught since receiving his PhD in the philosophy of religions from University of Chicago Divinity School. He's the author of 3 books, A Vision for Hinduism, Jainism, an Introduction, and a Historical Dictionary of Hinduism. And he's currently working on a 2-volume introduction to Indian philosophy. And without further ado, I'll pass you over to Professor Jeffery Long.
Sisters and brothers of California, thank you very much for that kind welcome and introduction. Swami Vivekananda's 150th birth anniversary has been keeping a lot of us very busy this year. And I've had the honor of giving talks on Swami Vivekananda and religious pluralism in a number of venues. And as I was preparing for this presentation, I realized that there are people present here who have heard at least one of those talks, in some cases 2 or even 3 of those talks. And so I'm trying to do something a little bit different today. At the same time, I'm mindful that there are those of you here who have not heard this presentation before, so I do want to cover the main points of it. But I'm trying to go to a little deeper level than I have done in some of my other talks that I would think of as being of a more introductory nature to Swami Vivekananda's thought. The title I've given this is Complementarity, Not Contradiction, Swami Vivekananda's Theology of Religions. And of course, the first thing about that might raise questions is the whole idea that Swami Vivekananda had a theology of religions. In one sense, he did not, because he was not what we might call a systematic theologian. Many of us suspect he might have become one had he been on this earth longer. There's certainly evidence that he was developing his thought and preparing to write a great work of systematic Vedanta, but unfortunately his body gave out before that could ever happen. But if one thinks of a theology, at least this is how I'm going to be using the term today, as a system of thought that is implicit, or rather an attempt to make explicit the thought that is implicit by virtue of taking a stand in a spiritual tradition, that theology as reflection from within that tradition, what in the West has been called faith-seeking understanding, what in the Hindu tradition has been called Brahma Jigyasa, the inquiry into the ultimate nature of reality, how to understand this conceptually. And within that broad definition of theology, a theology of religions is an attempt to articulate that understanding rooted in a particular worldview and practice of difference. What is the meaning of there being religions? Why are there many religions, and how does that impact our understanding of truth? So when I talk about Swami Vivekananda's theology of religions and his theology of religious pluralism, I just want to make clear that I'm not claiming that he had developed this system, but that a system is there, implicit in the background. And I think that one of the things that has been left to us, his successors, his followers, is to articulate that and to apply it and to develop it. So this is the beginning of my attempt to do that. Swami Vivekananda's theology of religious pluralism is frequently critiqued, but is rarely understood. When presented simplistically as the view that all religions are the same, the depth and the nuance of this perspective are lost, along with its capacity to transform the field of interfaith dialogue and interreligious relations generally around the world. I'm going to argue here that Swami Vivekananda's theology of religions, his implicit theology of religions, contains an element of the perennial philosophy, the idea of a shared conceptual and experiential core existing within the mystical strands of the world's religions. And that's the element of his philosophy, his theology, that's better known. But it also includes an element of what some of us now call deep religious pluralism. That is, the affirmation that many religions can be true, not despite their differences, but because these differences can be viewed as complementary rather than contradictory. This perspective unfolds into a more holistic approach to religious diversity than what is available from conventional perspectives that view difference, especially religious difference, as necessarily entailing competition and conflict. Swami Vivekananda envisions a future universal religion that, despite this terminology, does not consist of a single religion overcoming all others and emerging supreme from a clash of civilizations, but a commonwealth of religions working cooperatively and interacting in such a way that each enriches and is enriched by the others, just as a seed is enriched by the sun, soil, and water that form its environment, the kind of organic model that Joseph Prabhu was talking about a moment ago. So when we see Swami Vivekananda standing here very proudly, this is not a figure who is triumphantly looking over the shattered corpses of the other religions of the world that from which he has emerged triumphant. He's a gardener looking very proudly at his garden of many flowers and plants that are all growing and being enriched within the same environment. Swami Vivekananda, as I said a moment ago, unfortunately did not live long enough to present a fully systematized version of the theology of religions that's implicit in his works, but he does leave abundant clues as to the features such a system would need to have. So what I want to do here is lay out some of those features. This is the part of my presentation that may be familiar to some of you, and then build upon that to reflect on what that theology of religions might look like in its broad outline, in its broad contours. And I've got my half hour. I'd like to leave some time for at least a couple of questions as well. So let's see how this goes. The first feature, and I think it's fortuitous that this comes right after Joseph's presentation, is the idea that Swami Vivekananda wanted us to move beyond tolerance to the idea of what he called universal acceptance, which I think this is the more profound sense of what Joseph was calling tolerance, but Swamiji's own terminology was to actually avoid the word tolerance. In his first address in Chicago, he hints at this. He says, "I'm proud to belong to a religion which has taught the world both tolerance and universal acceptance. We believe not only in universal toleration, but we accept all religions as true." So not only toleration. And as Manohar pointed out in his question, and I've raised this rhetorically in earlier versions of this talk, when someone says to you, "I tolerate you," it's not a compliment, right? It's not really what we want to hear. It's better than "I don't tolerate you." It's better than, a gun, but it's not what we're capable of, right? Acceptance is the idea. And then in a later lecture, Swami Vivekananda elaborates on this. He says, our watchword then will be acceptance and not exclusion. Not only toleration, for so-called toleration is often blasphemy, and I do not believe in it. I believe in acceptance. Why should I tolerate? Toleration means that I think that you are wrong, and I'm just allowing you to live. Is it not blasphemy to think that you and I are allowing others to live? I accept all religions that were in the past and worship with them all. I worship God with every one of them in whatever form they worship him. And this was a portion which Joseph was also citing in his presentation. So the ideal here is universal acceptance. Well, the philosophers and logicians among us hear that and say, now wait a minute, how can there be acceptance of ideas which very often do contradict one another? Great example, again, I'm drawing on Joseph's presentation. Theism versus non-theism. One or the other of these must be the case. Swami Vivekananda talked about this, and he articulates a principle of complementarity rather than contradiction when we think we've come across contradictions between religious traditions. In one passage he says, "Are all the religions of the world really contradictory? I do not mean the external forms in which great thoughts are clad. I do not mean the different buildings, languages, rituals, books, etc. employed in various religions, but I mean the internal soul of every religion. And he elaborates on this idea of an internal soul. He says, every religion has a soul behind it, and that soul may differ from the soul of another religion, but are they contradictory? Do they contradict or supplement each other? That is the question. And then he goes on and says, I believe they're not contradictory, they're supplementary. Each religion, as it were, takes up one part of the great universal truth and spends its whole force in embodying and typifying that part of the great truth. It is therefore addition, not exclusion. That is the idea. System after system arises, each one embodying a great idea. So he invites us to think of difference not as contradiction, not as you must choose one or the other to be the case, but that, and to elaborate upon this, there's a great metaphor, and I threatened to use it again, but Prabhajika Vajrapana has come up with such a good metaphor for this, the idea of a jigsaw puzzle, the pieces of which are each different from one another. So one could argue that they are therefore contradictory, but if you arrange them in the correct way, you get a larger picture of a reality that no single piece can completely encompass. The third feature, mutual transformation through dialogue. The idea that, again, universal religion is not something to which people need to convert. The idea is that we all are what we are, that our own distinct tradition and culture and self-understanding is to be appreciated and nurtured, but that we can all learn from and assimilate elements from the others. And I think there's a very subtle difference between this idea and the sort of do-it-yourself religion pieced out of many elements that some of us have in mind when we think of this today. I think what he has in mind is, Joseph said this very well already, people very deeply committed to their own piece of the puzzle, their own tradition, but open to wisdom from others. And I like also to invoke Frank Clooney's image of deep learning across religious borders. You are situated somewhere, but that doesn't mean you're hermetically sealed from the rest. Swami Vivekananda says, the seed is put in the ground, and earth and air and water are placed around it. Does the seed become the earth or the air or the water? No, it becomes a plant. It develops after the law of its own growth, assimilates the air, the earth, and the water, converts them into plant substance, and grows into a plant. Similar is the case with religion. He says the Christian is not to become a Hindu or Buddhist, nor Hindu or Buddhist to become a Christian, but each must assimilate the spirit of the others, and yet preserve his individuality and grow according to his own law of growth. I would insert here that I don't think he's necessarily disallowing the possibility that someone might take up a different spiritual path from the one in which they were born. I think the language he's chosen here, though, is appropriate to his time, when people thought of themselves as belonging definitely to one tradition or another. What I think he's doing is saying that his ideal doesn't have anything to do with the religious label we place upon ourselves. It's not a matter of calling oneself an X, Y, or Z, but of openness to that which surrounds us. He goes on to elaborate what would happen if this kind of mutual transformation was going on. He says, my idea is that all these religions are different forces in the economy of God, working for the good of mankind, and that not one can become dead, not one can be killed. Just as you cannot kill any force in nature, so you cannot kill any one of these spiritual forces. The deeper ideal, the more profound truth that is the kernel of each religious tradition is a force of nature, he's saying, and it's going to operate in the world whatever we do. The fourth feature, it would be what I call the non-hegemonic character of the universal religion. Swami Vivekananda says, but if there is ever to be a universal religion, it must be one which will hold no location in place or time, which will be infinite like the God it will preach, whose sun shines upon the followers of Krishna or Christ, saints or sinners alike, which will not be the Brahmin or Buddhist, Christian or Muslim, but the sum total of all these, and still have infinite space for development. So he's not talking about a kind of inclusivism in the bad sense, I would say. I mean, there are, as Joseph said, there are elements there are other quotations that can be taken in that way, and there are ways in which you can find a sort of counter-inclusivism happening in Swami Vivekananda's thought. But I think when he's really reflecting deeply on universal religion, he's not talking about Hinduism or any one religion emerging supreme over the rest. So these are the basic elements, I think, that Swami Vivekananda has defined in his thought. Now, what do we do with this? What kind of theology of religions emerges from this? Well, first of all, as I've already hinted earlier, there are two dimensions of this theology of religions, and both of them need to be sort of kept retained in tension with one another. Again, I keep referring back to Joseph's talk. He's already said everything, so I can probably sit down. But there is a dimension of it that is, you could see this as the more inclusivist side, and that is the perennialist dimension. The idea that there is a shared core, a common experience, a direct experience at the heart of all the world's religions. Now, he actually, I find he doesn't generally talk about this when he's talking about universal religion. It comes up in other settings where he's talking about the foundation of all of his teaching. And one, I think, especially revealing quote is where he says, Swami Vivekananda characterizes his own teaching as his own interpretation, he says, of our ancient books in the light which my master shed upon them, Sri Ramakrishna. He says, I claim no supernatural authority. Whatever in my teaching may appeal to the highest intelligence and be accepted by thinking people, the adoption of that will be my reward. And this is really what characterizes his Vedanta as I would say, a modern Vedanta that is drawn not so much on textual authority as on direct experience, and the intellect reflecting on the meaning of that experience. What kind of experience is he talking about? What direct experience of what? And as we all know, Swami Vivekananda liked to give these provocative statements from time to time that would shock people. And here's another one for you. He says, can we see God? Of course not. Can we know God? Of course not. If God can be known, he will be God no longer. Knowledge is limitation. But I and my Father are one. I find the reality in my soul. These ideas are expressed in some religions and in others only hinted. Now, this is a shocking statement when you keep in mind that the famous first meeting of Swami Vivekananda with Ramakrishna, their first conversation was one in which Swami Vivekananda, at the time Narendranath Datta, asked Ramakrishna, have you seen God? And Ramakrishna says, yes, only better than I'm seeing you right now. And so, clearly Ramakrishna had seen God, at least as he understood himself. Can we know God? He says, of course not. And of course, if, like me, you're part of the Vedanta tradition, one of our most famous and beloved books is called How to Know God. So what does he mean by of course not? Well, another Swami, whom I admire a great deal, Swami Tyagananda, explains this verse. He says, Swamiji is here drawing a distinction between knowledge, which he puts in quotation marks, which involves objectification and the instrumentality of the mind and the senses, and finding the reality in my soul, which is direct experience, not filtered through the mind and senses. So in other words, by direct experience, what is meant is not knowledge in our ordinary sense of reality mediated through the mind, but it is being the reality. And on some level, that reality of being that becomes part of our consciousness. And probably my favorite quotation of all time from Swami Vivekananda elaborates upon this. He's using the language of Sankhya. I'm kind of looking at Jerry over there. He says, the Purusha, the soul, does not love. It is love itself. It does not exist. It is existence itself. The soul does not know. It is knowledge itself. It is a mistake to say the soul loves, exists, or knows. Love, existence, and knowledge are not the qualities of the Purusha, but its essence. So here, I think we really have the heart of, you could say, the authority behind Swami Vivekananda's teaching. It is in this direct experience of being the soul. And the perennial philosophy is the idea that this experience is available to, and in fact occurs within, all of the world's religions. And Ramakrishna himself experienced this through a great variety of traditions. And so it was this understanding of direct experience that became the lens through which Swami Vivekananda then interpreted the Hindu scriptures and various other traditions that he became aware of. The fountainhead of all knowledge is the direct experience of the self, not the ego, but the divine self that dwells within all beings. Now, this perennialist approach has drawn criticism over the years for what can be seen as the hegemonic nature of this approach because it privileges a particular type of experience that's emphasized very strongly in some traditions, but marginalized in others. There have been religious traditions in certain periods of history where you could get in big trouble for saying, I am that. Jesus Christ, for example, at least on one interpretation, got in big trouble for this. I and the Father are one. So it's not a perspective that we could say is finally sufficient for explaining the diversity of religions we experience. Theologian Mark Heim points out in his book Salvations, and David Ray Griffin similarly points out in the edited volume Deep Religious Pluralism, that the ends to which various religions conceive of themselves as being oriented differ. In my own work, including in the Griffin volume I just mentioned, I've delineated 3 types of religious ultimate and 3 types of corresponding spiritual practice and experience. A non-personal transcendental principle that one contemplates in order to realize it in oneself, a personal deity with which one cultivates a personal relationship, and the cosmos itself, or nature, with which one cultivates harmony. But Swami Vivekananda's theology of religions is not limited only to the perennialist dimension, the unifying experience that is the basis of all his teaching. As we've already seen, he's talked about deep complementarity, and he's also affirmed that this way of thinking is to be non-hegemonic in nature. So there's another dimension which corresponds to what we now call deep religious pluralism, which is the idea that, again, difference itself is not to be subsumed or surpassed. Difference is not a problem. It is, in fact, to be seen as complementarity and as something on the basis of which a richer and more profound worldview could be developed. Resources for developing the deep pluralist side of Swami Vivekananda's theology of religions exist both within his own teaching and I would say in external resources. And I believe his idea of mutual transformation and dialogue and ongoing learning would support looking into other resources as well. And I'll just mention some of these and then I'll stop speaking. From within his own teaching, you have, of course, the idea of the 4 yogas. And this carries with it the deep pluralistic understanding that people with diverse spiritual makeups require similarly diverse ideals and practices that will correspond to one another and that will take them where they want to go. In fact, some of these correspond pretty nicely to the 3 ultimate reality models that I just mentioned a moment ago. Karma yoga can be connected with the idea of cosmic harmony. Jnana yoga to, of course, the realization of a transcendental principle. Bhakti yoga with theism. And Raja yoga could be an aid to all of these. And, of course, a direct route in its own right. Other resources for developing Swami Vivekananda's, I would say, implicit theology of religions. One I've written about a great deal are the Jain doctrines of Anikantvad, Nayavad, and Syadvad, which I don't have time to go into right now, but they facilitate a logic of complementarity instead of conflict when one is faced with difference. The idea from the Jain perspective is when you see difference, you should not have the 2 options clash with one another, but you should try to integrate them. Whiteheadian process philosophy, which provides a model of reality in which the singular holistic existence of which we're all part can be shown to have features that correspond to the multiple religious ideals of the world's traditions. The transcendental principle of creativity, the divine embodiment of that principle, and the cosmos of actual entities. And then there's Vedanta itself. And because Swami Vivekananda himself emphasized Advaita Vedanta to such a great extent, the other systems of Vedanta are often less known, at least in the Western world. But there are systems of Vedanta which talk in very interesting ways about the relationship between Brahman as a highest unifying principle, Ishvara, the divine reality, the jivas, the souls making up the world, and the jagat, the world itself. And that this internal pluralism of reality can also support the idea of the multiple ways in which the spiritual quest manifests, and yet be seen as part of a unified world, not a relativist kind of world that doesn't make sense. So I think, given my limited time, I'm going to stop there, and I don't know if there's time for at least one question or... Okay. Okay.
Depending on how complex and long the answers are. So
Okay.
Q&A if you want to take
I'm T.S. Rukmani. I just retired from Concordia University as the former chair in Hindu Studies. Thank you very much, Jeff, for that very illuminating talk. I thought you said, maybe I understood you wrongly, that Swami Vivekananda's interpretation of Vedanta, of course it's Advaita Vedanta, is more experience-based, and it differs from the textual interpretation. I beg to differ there, because throughout the Advaitic tradition, Aham Brahmasmi is always experiential. It's just not possible, Shravana Manana and Nididhyasana, it's not possible to have that subject-object relationship. So I was wondering whether that was just a slip of the tongue or you really meant it.
Well, something in between, because I've been involved with quite a bit of conversation. I let myself get embroiled into this online chat group called Hindu Dharma Forums, and there was a lot of talk about this distinction. And I think sometimes it's a distinction that could be made too sharply between what might be seen as a traditional text-based approach and a modern experiential approach, that clearly both are present in both modes, and maybe it's a question of emphasis. But my sense of Shankara's Vedanta, shaped quite a bit by my fellow panelist, Anant here, is that for the spiritual practitioner, the Shabda Pramana is really an essential part of the spiritual unfolding which take place. Yes, ultimately the goal is an experience, the experience of Aham Brahmasmi. It's not clear to me that that was the case for Ramakrishna, but that his was more of a kind of instinctive and from the heart, practice-based experiential Vedanta. And that, again, if we push that distinction too hard, then we make both Shankara and Ramakrishna into a caricature, because Shankaracharya was not teaching a dry, experience-less book learning, and nor, I think, was Swami Vivekananda certainly saying, throw all the scriptures into the Ganges, but that for those of us who've not yet had the experience, for example, it's absolutely essential to receive that kind of teaching. So I wouldn't want to push the distinction too hard, but I do think it's present. I think the distinction's present. And I think it's an important distinction, because if you are, let's say, a Westerner in 1893 in the Parliament of World Religions, and you're hearing Swami Vivekananda speak, and you have not yet had access to the Vedas or the Upanishads, and maybe it's an open question for you as to what the scriptural foundation of knowledge should be. The idea of an experiential foundation has a much more scientific ring to it. And I think this was part of the attraction of Swami Vivekananda for many in the West, is that this is presented as a science of self-realization, contrasted with something that is more scripture-based, which sounds to Western ears like maybe a biblical fundamentalism, from which people are recoiling, and that's why they're coming to a talk by Swami Vivekananda. So I think that to the extent that it's presented as almost a science of the self, that's a distinction, I think, in the modern mode from the earlier one. But I wouldn't want to push it too hard, certainly. I think that it's been used to ill effect that way. So, okay. Very well. Thank you all very much.
Okay, so our next speaker is Professor Makarand Paranjape, who is a professor at JN University in Delhi. Professor Paranjape is a critic, poet, novelist, short story writer, literary columnist, and reviewer. He's the author and the editor of over 30 books, and has published nearly 150 academic papers. He was the editor of the Penguin Swami Vivekananda Reader and co-editor of the Cyclonic Swami Vivekananda in the West. His latest publications include two monographs, Acts of Faith, Journeys to Sacred India, and Making India, National Culture and the Afterlife of Indian English Authority. So I'll hand you over to Professor Paranjape, who's going to talk on Swami Vivekananda and the idea of universal religion.
Thank you very much. It's really a privilege to be here. I want to thank Rita and the entire organizing team, religious studies here, Varun, Duncan, and everybody, for giving me this opportunity, and also to thank DCF. It's a really wonderful group of Indian Americans. I'm very proud of our community here when I see the kind of work they put in, time, money, dedication, energy. It's really very inspiring. Thank you so much. I also want to thank our hosts, Dr. Narayan Swami. I don't know where he is, but thank you very much. It's wonderful to be here. And finally, I want to acknowledge the Vedanta Society of Southern California, where several months ago when I came here for another Vedanta and Vivekananda conference which Chris organized, I can't see him here, but, there, thanks. So they invited me to give a talk, and I spoke. That was my trial run. That was my those preliminary remarks I made on Swamiji's idea of a universal religion. And I've been thinking about it ever since then and working on this paper. And, I'm happy to say it's written and it's 10,000 words. So obviously I can't read it. And yesterday we were talking about, the anxieties of presenters. How do you, let alone do justice to the topic, which is quite difficult. How do you do justice even to your own paper? And Professor Kapoor, my mentor, former rector at Jawaharlal Nehru University where I worked, so he said, you shouldn't worry. You should just go up there and say just what you feel like. And that's exactly what I'm going to do. I'm not going to read, perhaps except for a few excerpts. And so you'll pardon me if I'm a little incoherent. And also I must clarify that my training is not in religion or in philosophy, but in literary studies. But I hope that, my teachers have taught me a little bit about reading texts. Or I should put it the other way. I hope I've learned a little bit about reading texts from my teachers. So with those preliminary remarks, I wanted to say that the idea of universal religion, and it's slightly different from the idea of a universal religion, which I'm going to come to right at the end, was extremely important to Swami Vivekananda. We've heard this in other talks today. And Jeff, my friend with whom, we've been sort of tag teaming on some of these events related to Swamiji, has already given you many quotations. But it was really important to him, starting from his very first address at Chicago, where he talked about this universal religion. Let me just quote that passage. He says that in his 19 September address at the Parliament of Religions, he says, "To the Hindu, then, the whole world of religions is only a traveling, a coming up of different men and women through various conditions and circumstances to the same goal. Every religion is only evolving a God out of material man, and the same God is the inspirer of all of them. Why then are there so many contradictions? They are only apparent, says the Hindu. The contradictions come from the same truth, adapting itself to the varying circumstances of different natures." And then he goes on to say, the Hindu may have failed to carry out all his plans, but if there is ever to be a universal religion, it must be one which will have no location in place or time, which will be infinite like the God. And I think Jeff read it out, so I needn't complete it, that quotation. So right from his first major address outside India, and right to the end of his days, he kept talking about this notion of a universal religion. And trawling through the 9 volumes, I've counted 240 references to the universal in his works. And, he talks about all kinds of universal things. So the idea of the universal is very important to Swamiji. And some combination of universal religion, either universal religion as a continuous phrase or universal and then religion appearing slightly later, 2 or 3 words later, or maybe later in the same sentence or the same paragraph, occurs about 145 times. So you can see that this was extremely important to him. And actually, it's surprising that given the amount of scholarship on Swamiji, and especially in this 150th year, people are talking about various aspects of his life and work. This aspect hasn't received a lot of attention. In fact, in the literature, in the secondary literature, the only person who has really studied this aspect seriously is Professor Arvind Sharma. He has a wonderful book called The Concept of Universal Religion in Modern Hindu Thought, published by Palgrave in 1998. And this book is extraordinary because what Professor Sharma does is, from Ram Mohan Roy right up to Gandhi, he traces the idea of universal religion in Hindu thought, in modern Hindu thought. So there's another story waiting to be told here or unpacked, though I think he does tell that story. But the question is, why were all these Hindu thinkers in the modern times so concerned about the idea of universality in religion? And I suspect it was because they believed that if there was one field in which India and Hinduism could make a unique contribution, it would be the field of religion. And Vivekananda always said that each culture, each society, each nation has a specific talent, aptitude, predilection. And for India, it was religion or spirituality. He kept saying that this was the backbone of Indian civilization. And if you want to change Indian society, you've got to change religion. So this was his methodology. But I think we have to think about why all these people, Dayanand Saraswati, Keshab Chandra Sen, Sri Aurobindo, Gandhi, all of these people keep talking about the idea of a universal religion. So I hope I can come back to it right at the end of my presentation. But just to kind of sum up the problematic here in Swamiji's thought, you see two quite different positions in these 145 references to universal religion. On the one hand, he clearly says that it's impossible. You know, he divides religion into three sections, and he says that each religion has philosophy, rituals, and I think practices. I've got the quotation here. And he says that, and then he picks up each of these, and he says that you cannot have a commonality or agreement on any of these three aspects. So essentially, he's almost ruling out the idea of a universal religion ever coming into being, on the one hand. So he's actually talking about its impossibility. And let me just read out that quotation to you. He says, for example, and this is from his speech, the ideal of a universal religion. This was a speech he gave several times. I've also identified the number of times he gave this talk, starting in 1896. But we've lost those early speeches. But the version we have dates back to the San Francisco lecture in 1900. And that's the one in the complete works. And in this lecture called The Ideal of a Universal Religion, he says, we find then that if by the idea of a universal religion, it is meant that one sect of doctrines should be believed in by all mankind, it is wholly impossible. It can never be. There can never be a time when all faces will be the same. And he adds, any attempt to bring all humanity to one method of thinking in spiritual things has been a failure and always will be a failure. And then he actually goes on. So there are two lectures given very close to each other. One in Pasadena, where he talks about the way to the realization of this universal religion. Both were given in January 1900. And the other one in San Francisco, where he talks about the ideal of a universal religion. And taken together, they form the kind of core of his thinking on this topic. But then there are, as I said, many, many other references. So you will see that on the one hand, he's saying that it's actually impossible for people to agree on this topic. And then he goes to celebrate difference, which is where I kind of disagree with what Joseph was saying. You know, he talks about the proliferation of sects And he says that it's a very good thing. He says of all the ancient religions, all have thrived and prospered except Zoroastrianism. And he says that, all the other ancient religions have survived, and there's no chance that one will overcome the others. And there are more sects, more religions coming into being. And he says that that's actually a wonderful idea. And he celebrates difference in that sense. So it's not that he's presenting a kind of inclusivism where everything gets included under one umbrella. And I can, read the quotations, but there's not enough time for that. So on the one hand, he's saying it's impossible for everybody to agree on one set of beliefs, one set of rituals, one set of doctrines, or one set of philosophies. So if you consider that to be universal religion, it'll never happen. And then on the other hand, he's saying, in this other speech given in Pasadena called The Way to the Realization of a Universal Religion, he says that, and that universal religion about which philosophers and others have dreamed in every country already exists. It is here, as the universal brotherhood of man is already existing. So also is universal religion. Brotherhood already exists, only there are numbers of persons who fail to see this and only upset it by crying for new brotherhoods. Universal religion, too, is already existing. So you see that between these two poles, one in which he asserts that it is impossible to have a universal religion, and the other pole where he says, well, it already exists. Between these two so-called contradictory poles, there are a variety of views that he presents. And Professor Sharma outlines 7 of these views. If I have time, I'll quote him in a minute. But I just wanted to sort of, say that, I just want to quote one aspect of my introduction where I'm kind of laying out how I see this problematic. And it's my contention that Vivekananda reworked his guru's proclamation of the equality and validity of all religions, Joto Mot Toto Pot, in a more challenging, even contestatory international environment. And this is where I agree with Joseph. And I want to respond a bit to what he was saying, that, the context of his remarks is very, very important. So where he sees the attempts of Abrahamic traditions or other traditions swamping and browbeating Hinduism and attacking Hinduism, then he does a kind of reverse Orientalism. He reverses the gaze, and he says, actually, because Hinduism is plural, it's superior. But he, in a level playing field, I would contend he would never talk about the superiority of any faith. So it's a strategic aggression that he mounts when he sees Hinduism attacked. So it's a very post-colonial position, really, And there I agree, it's a kind of liberation theology, but it's not meant to be taken as a settled view, So Jyotirmay Sharma's recent book, where he talks about Swamiji as the progenitor of a kind of cultural nationalism and Hindu supremacism, is completely mistaken. You see, because Swamiji's words had a performative dimension. They were not only enunciatory. And the performative dimension had to do with the fact that he was giving speeches in very specific contexts. So you couldn't take these words out of context and simply say this is what he always believed in, And in fact, I liked what Professor Sharma said in the morning, where he talked about Hinduism implies a cosmological indeterminacy, I think he said, It refuses to fix and pin meaning. And in a way, the heart of Swamiji's idea of universal religion is precisely that it keeps teasing us in its refusal to fix what he really wanted to say or mean by it. And in that sense, I think that our purpose is not so much to make explicit the implicit, as Jeff was saying, but actually to celebrate the fact that that the idea of a universal religion to Swami Vivekananda is always a kind of invitation, la venir, something that will happen perhaps in a distant horizon of a different kind, where consciousness itself shifts. And in that sense, he anticipates what Sri Aurobindo was saying. And I think my friend Debashish is going to talk about that a bit, that the idea of or the ideal of universal religion is something that's beckoning to us from the future. It'll be a time in which you can have difference without conflict. And for that to happen, mentality as we know it has to be transformed. And for Sri Aurobindo, it had to happen through supramentalization. Anyhow, so I would argue that Vivekananda reworked his Guru's proclamation of the equality and validity of all religions in a more challenging, even contestatory international environment. Rather than one religion imposing itself on others and thereby calling itself universal, or eliminating differences in existing religions so as to arrive at some common denominator, or even artificially inventing a new religion for all humankind, Vivekananda was interested in looking at a number of different approaches to this issue, including complementarity, as we heard, supplementarity, individuality. That is to say that universal religion really means each individual following their own path to the ultimate reality, call it God, call it dharma, call it liberation, call it moksha, call it kaivalya. So that individual exploration is what makes it universal. You might call it extreme individuality implies a commonality of pursuit. And then self-realization. And this is what, in a way, Swami Sarvadevananda said in his concluding remarks to my talk. He said, universal religion, what Swamiji really meant is that each one realizes God in his or her own way. And that thrust, that aspiration for God realization, called by different names, is what he meant by universal realization. So, in the process, he comes up with at least three important formulations. That is of religious pluralism, the superiority of Vedanta and Hinduism, and the idea of a universal religion. In effect, he wished to create a new way of understanding religious experience, somewhat akin to that of modern science, whose methodology comes the closest to a cultural and value-free universal epistemology. So I want to sort of supplement, what Jeff said by saying that by universal he simply meant, could there be a universal methodology to discuss religious issues as there was for science? And he has these very excited letters that he writes talking about his meeting with Tesla, talking about his own Vedantic cosmology, which he was hoping to write up and establish, prove, using rational means that there was some kind of universal quest, a religious quest, or a way of understanding religion which was like science, value-free and universal. He didn't quite get around to doing it, but that was one of the aspects of what he meant by universal. Universal in the sense of scientific, universal in the sense of, not cultural, not subjective, not based on time and space, but something that, actually applied to different parts of the world at different points of time. Now, one aspect of his idea of universality, Jeff has already talked about perennialism, but the other aspect is when he talks about Hinduism as a model for a universal religion, because he uses the Rigvedic idea of Ekam Sat Vipra Bahuda Vadanti as a model to devise or a universal religion, which would have unity of purpose or unity of truth of some sort, unity of a of the ground of being, existence, like Brahman. The ground of being is one. The idea of oneness. And then infinite diversity within that kind of unity. So he tried to use this as a model for one of his ideas of universal religion. Joseph was mentioning how when he spoke in the West, he gave a certain kind of, sort of interpretation of Vedanta or of Buddhism. And when he spoke in India, he gave another. And he quoted that extremely acerbic criticism of Hindu practices, which immediately tells you that he could never be a Hindu supremacist, because he was not an apologist for everything that went under the name of Hindu or Vedanta. He was a merciless critic, and that's where we saw how another idea of universal religion for Swami Vivekananda was the idea of service, the idea of Daridra Narayan, where he says, in a letter to Swami Brahmananda, he says, doing good is universal religion. So wherever you see people doing good to their fellow human beings, that is universal religion. So that comes up as one of his several definitions or ways of understanding universal religion. But the point is that it's also interesting that in India, it was in India where he was most unsparing of Hindu thought, Hindu practices, Indian society in general, the treatment of women, the treatment of untouchables, the treatment of the so-called downtrodden and poor sections of society. That is where he was hailed as a champion of Hinduism, who had gone and shown the West that basically, held up the self-respect of Hindus in the West. And, if you look at his so-called Digvijaya, his victory march from Colombo to Almora, in fact, there's a book, lectures from Colombo to Almora. It's very interesting that wherever he goes, he's hailed as this kind of savior and champion of Hinduism. And everywhere he inflects that kind of praise in his reply by saying, yes, that's all very good, but what I really mean is not that Hinduism is really superior, but insofar as it is accepting, insofar as it is non-dogmatic, insofar as it is open, and insofar as it is inclusive. Not in the sense of inclusive meaning you absorb everybody into your own framework, but insofar as it is non-exclusive, let me put it that way. Insofar as it is all these things, it is actually superior. So he's always saying it in a very interesting way, not in the triumphalist way in which his hosts are addressing him and hailing him as some kind of sort of Hindu champion and savior. And I also noticed a slight shift in tone that you see, then by the time he reaches, from Colombo, he crosses over to Ramnad, Pamban, Kumbakonam. He's kind of making his way up, Chennai, and I've got quotations from all these places. And finally, he reaches Kolkata, you see. And again, the tone changes a bit. And in Almora, he's really tired of all this talk of sort of Hindu supremacism or whatever it is. And he says, listen, let's not talk about all this. I've come here, I want to create a center, where anybody wishing to realize himself or herself, has a place to come and do so. And let me tell you, he says, in Almora, that the essence of religion is renunciation. And everything else is not religion. And that's the center called Mayavati. And that's the only place where you don't even have a photo, let alone an image of Sri Ramakrishna, because everywhere else, Sri Ramakrishna is actually worshipped, but I think in Mayavati, there's, So you can see how his own thought shifts according to the context, but it's never fixed. It's always fluid. He's always keeping these possibilities open. So I think I've spoken for about 24 minutes now, and I'm going to just come to the conclusion right now. And I apologize to Professor Sharma. I'm not quoting you. I don't have he's gone out, so it's okay. I wanted to quote his, how he characterizes Swamiji's idea of a universal religion. So let me just read out my conclusion so that we have at least four minutes for a discussion, 4 or 5 minutes. Ultimately, the thrust of Vivekananda's idea of universal religion was to shift the discourse of world religion from the politics of competitive domination and expansion to that of mutual respect and acceptance. So what I'm really saying is that the idea of universal religion was one way in which Swamiji was trying to change the definition of the word religion itself. Anyhow, with his powerful presence and personality, not to speak of powers of oratory and rational presentation, he was able to convince a critical mass of people in the West that the time had come to broaden their religious horizons. In India, he directed his energies at the ongoing project of religious reform and social responsibility, urging his fellow countrymen and women to inject more compassion into their religious practices. He campaigned for the downtrodden, whether they were women or members of the depressed castes. He argued for religious freedom and openness, at the same time arousing the self-respect and asserting the religious dignity and rights of a colonized and conquered people. No wonder some of his followers, like Swami Bhajanananda, rank his ideas of universal religion as higher than the three positions of exclusivism, inclusivism, and pluralism identified by people like Bishop when they try to define what happened at the Parliament of World Religions. So Swami Bhajananda says Swami Vivekananda took pluralism one step further by showing that pluralism must culminate in universalism. Universalism is one of Swamiji's great contributions to the modern world. Whether we agree with this view or not, Vivekananda's contribution to global religious ecumenism cannot be doubted. But deliberately leaving his idea of universal religion undefined, he continues to tease and challenge us to try to understand its possibilities, which, as he shows us, include the acceptance of and harmony between different existing traditions, Sarva Dharma Sambhava, an inclusivist Vedantic integration between different existing traditions based on the perennial philosophy which they subscribe to, individualist particularism that accommodates even every type of religious belief, the opposition of one set of dogmas, rituals, or philosophies imposing themselves on others, both shallow and deep religious pluralism, dialogic syncretism between different faiths and faith communities, common pursuits in all religions such as faith in God, desire for self-realization, or working for the welfare of others, and realization as an already existing oneness based on the common ground of being or existence, being able to see the unity underlying apparent religious diversity. And finally, a future realization of higher consciousness in which the present religious conflicts and divisions may be overcome. But even this list does not fully exhaust the possibilities of what he meant by universal religion. Thank you very much.
My name is Star, and spiritual teacher title, Baba Baby Bear, because Baby Bear likes everything just right. Righteousness is a good thing. And the universal religion is love, just like 9 months in the womb, the intimacy of every human fetus. So basically, it's conscious awareness in every moment to maximize being love in human form, which is being God in human form. If A equals B and B equals C, then C equals A. If God is love and I am love, then I am God, or one with God. So that's a challenge for humanity. Another term for God realization is love realization, to make love real. If someone has a need, if they're hungry and you give them food, then God feels real to them because they're just praying and say, oh, God, provide me the food. That's the universal religion that already exists, is love. Even atheists have what they call ethical atheism, which means they're practicing love. So it's the thing about every moment is an opportunity. Every split second is an opportunity to function at optimum love capacity.
So next speaker, we've got Anantanand Rambachan, who spent a lot of time in Leeds, in fact, which is very interesting to me. I'm from Leeds too. We'll have to talk about that later. Professor Rambachan is Professor of Religion, Philosophy and Asian Studies at St. Olaf College in Minnesota. Like I said, he did his PhD and MA in Leeds and also studied in Trinidad. And Professor Rambachan is the author of several books, book chapters and articles. Amongst his books, we have Accomplishing the Accomplished, The Limits of Scripture, The Advaita Worldview, God, World and Humanity, and the Hindu Vision, and Gita-mritam, the essential writings of the Bhagavad Gita. So I'll hand you over to Professor Rambachan, who's going to talk on a talk titled An Advaita Christology, Swami Vivekananda's Reflection on the Meaning of Jesus. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And let me join my fellow panelists in saying that's how honored and grateful I am to have the opportunity to present at this conference, and to thank everyone who has worked to make this possible. My presentation today is titled An Advaita Christology, Swami Vivekananda's Reflection on the Meaning of Jesus. Christology in the Christian theological tradition is systematic reflection on the nature and significance of Jesus, who Jesus is. And there are two things that I want to do in my presentation. First, to sort of tease out the Christology that Vivekananda presents in his lectures and his writings. And secondly, to offer a critical assessment, or at least a preliminary critical evaluation of this theology. After Hinduism, the tradition that engaged Swami Vivekananda's attention and thought the most was Christianity, more than any of the other Indian religions. And there are many reasons for this. Swami Vivekananda inherited the history of the Brahmo Samaj and the Brahmo Samaj interest in Christ and Christianity. The Brahmo Samaj founder Ram Mohan Roy and his successor Keshav Chandra Sen spoke and wrote significantly about Christianity. And as a young man, Swami Vivekananda was active, very active, in the circles of the Brahmo Samaj, especially in the Navavidhan, or the new dispensation, which was founded by Keshav Chandra Sen. He attended meetings, he lived among Brahmo students, and he loved to sing Brahmo Samaj songs. He was, of course, educated at the Scottish Church College in Calcutta, an institution that was founded by the Christian missionary Alexander Duff. And one assumes that he would have had significant exposure to Christianity and even read Christian texts. Christian missionaries were active in Calcutta, often igniting controversies there. And the ruling British elite identified closely with Christianity, which was de facto the religion of the state, an alliance that would have been very obvious to Swami Vivekananda. Now, Vivekananda's earliest known views about Christ and Christianity were expressed in a preface that he wrote to his Bengali translation of a small Christian text called The Imitation of Christ. And this is a text that is attributed to a medieval Catholic monk, Thomas Kempis. Vivekananda translated 6 chapters of this work. He added appropriate quotations from Hindu texts, and he submitted these to a Bengali monthly. Clearly, this text, The Imitation of Christ, engaged him, and it was in fact the only text, along with the Bhagavad Gita, that he kept with him during his years of traveling around India after the death of Sri Ramakrishna. In his own words, he translated and published this text in order to present to Hindus what he understood to be the true spirit of Christianity, which is, when you think about it, is quite an extraordinary step to get Hindus to understand what he thought to be the true spirit of Christianity in a time when missionaries were attacking the tradition with great ferocity. Vivekananda felt that this true spirit of Christianity was absent from the lives of most Christians with whom Hindus interacted, and he wanted to redress what he saw as this imbalance. But he also realized that he needed to overcome a Hindu antagonism towards Christianity because of aggressive proselytization and the work of the missionaries. So he in the preface, he made an interesting move, and I'm just reading a few lines from this. This is Vivekananda's from his preface. He says, "To those of my countrymen who under the influence of blind bigotry may seek to belittle this book because it is the work of a Christian, I shall quote one aphorism of Vaisheshika Darshana and say nothing more. The aphorism is, in Sanskrit, Aptopadesha Vakyam Shabda, which means that the teachings of the Siddha Purushas have a probative force, and this is technically known as Shabda Pramana. And he goes on to say that Rishi Jaimini, the commentator, says that such people may be born among Aryans, but also among the Malichas. So this is how he justifies his translation. So this is his earliest work, earliest written work, in fact, 1899, 4 years before he came to speak at the Parliament. But I think already when we read his translation and his preface, we could see the important elements of his understanding of Christianity already being articulated there. He said that he could identify with the author of this work because the author's values and his aspirations coincided so well with those of the Hindu sannyasin, the Hindu renunciant. So he spoke about renunciation. He spoke about sadhana, the ceaseless spiritual effort that is there in this writer. And so we see, I think, something here that becomes very important as a central theme is understanding of Jesus, which is Jesus as the model embodiment of renunciation. Now, I want to identify a few components of his Christology. And the first is Jesus, the otherworldly renunciant. Vivekananda represents Jesus as entirely otherworldly, with no interest, as he says, in this world and its belongings. He is very critical of interpreters who have spoken of Jesus as a politician, as a patriotic Jew, or even as a military leader. The Gospels, according to Vivekananda, offer no justification for such readings. And he cites a few texts. Matthew 8:20, the foxes have holes, the birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. It's one of his favorite texts. So he speaks of Jesus as disembodied, as unfettered, as an unbound spirit with no consciousness of his physical body. Jesus, to Vivekananda then, was above all else a sannyasin. And his teachings, according to Vivekananda, were meant to be followed only by sannyasins. The world and life in this world had no interest for him. His only purpose was to push it forward and to enable everyone to realize his or her spiritual nature. It was on this issue, on the subject of renunciation, that Vivekananda's disappointment with the dichotomy between Christian ideal and practice becomes most acute and very sharp. So he was very strongly critical of Christians who had strayed far from the ideals of Christianity. And some of his most powerful remarks were about this dichotomy. In a lecture that he gave at Detroit, he was almost bursting with righteous indignation. "You are not Christians," he said. "No, as a nation you are not. Go back to Christ. Go back to him who had nowhere to lay his head." What an irony of fate. Reverse this if you want to live. Reverse this. It's all hypocrisy that I have heard in this country. All this prosperity, all this from Christ. Christ would have denied such heresies. If you can join these two, this wonderful prosperity with the ideal of Christ, it is well. But if you cannot, better go back to him and give this up. And very powerful words. Better to live in rags with Christ than to live in palaces without him. From a lecture in Detroit. The second is Jesus as the ahistorical teacher. Vivekananda's characterization of Jesus as the teacher of a doctrine of otherworldliness is connected very closely with this dimension of his Christology. His almost complete disinterest in the historical Jesus, which is, of course, a subject of central concern for the Christian tradition. In response to a question about the crucifixion of Jesus, his answer was direct and terse. Christ was God incarnate. They could not crucify him. That which was crucified was a semblance, a mirage. He seemed to be aware of, well aware, I would say, of certain scholarly disputes about the historical Jesus, but he gives no significance. He's not interested in this. He doesn't spend any time wondering why this may be important to the Christian tradition from the earliest times. Historical truths seem to Vivekananda to be non-essential. He does not question Jesus' historicity, but he attributes no special significance to the connection between history and religious meaning or religious significance. And perhaps this is one of his most, sorry, I probably went. This is one of his most famous statements on this issue. We are not here to discuss how much of the New Testament is true. We are not here to discuss how much of that life is historical. It does not matter whether the New Testament was written within 500 years of his birth, nor does it matter even how much of that life is true. But there is something behind it, something we want to imitate. One interesting aside on this whole issue of historicity, because although he is not interested in Christian claims for the historical Jesus, he's concerned to argue that Christ was Asiatic. And this is an idea that Vivekananda inherited from the Brahmo Samaj leader Ram Mohan Roy and the Keshab Chandra Sen. Keshab Chandra Sen had given a very famous lecture, Jesus Christ, Europe and Asia, in 1866. And one imagines that perhaps Vivekananda had heard this lecture because he draws heavily from Keshab Chandra Sen in his own articulation of the Asiatic Jesus. This was important to him. While he was not concerned with Jesus' historicity, the Asiatic Jesus was very important to him, because I think it enabled him to claim that Jesus is better understood in India than in the West. It was the ground also for challenging the Eurocentric focus of Christianity and arguing for the superiority of Asia in religious matters in spite of Western political might. So at one point he says, who are following the teachings of the Gita? The Europeans. And who are living according to the will of Jesus Christ? The descendants of Sri Krishna, according to Vivekananda. The third is Jesus the Advaitin. And so Swami Vivekananda's otherworldly Jesus, whose significance will not be found in the facts of history, was preeminently a teacher of Advaita. This is how he saw Jesus. His Christology was informed decisively by a theory of human religious evolution that some have already spoken about in earlier papers. But it's very important. In Vivekananda's view, the world of religions, as he puts it, is only a traveling, a coming up. Okay, I think I went a little bit ahead of my... The world of religions is only a traveling, a coming up of different men and women through various conditions and circumstances to the same goal. Now, for Vivekananda, the climax of this journey is Advaita, the awakening to a non-dual reality underlying and constituting the self of the universe. And this awakening is available in all of the religions of the world. The parts may be different, but the goal of non-duality is one and the same. So in many places in his writings, he traces this evolution that is going on as he saw it in all religions. In the first stage, God is understood as a sort of an extra cosmic being, omnipotent, omniscient. There is little intimacy between God and the human being. The second stage is what we might speak of today as panentheism. God is understood not only in the heavens, but also here, present in our world, and most importantly, in the human being. But the highest and final stage of religious evolution is the discovery of non-dual truth, the identity of the self with Brahman. So all religions, according to Vivekananda, all religions reflect these three evolutionary phases. Now he employs the Hindu teaching about adhikara bheda, or the necessity of a teacher to relate his teaching to the student's religious aptitude. And he reads Jesus as a teacher of this kind. And this is the quote that I had here, and I'm reading. To the masses who could not conceive of anything higher than a personal God, he said, pray to your Father in heaven. To those who could grasp a higher idea, he said, I am the vine, you are the branches. But to the disciples to whom he revealed himself more fully, he proclaimed the highest truth, and my Father are one. Vivekananda felt that or thought that the dualistic teachings of Jesus were meant for the uneducated masses who could not understand the higher teaching. And he felt that his theory of religious evolution from dualism to non-dualism was alone capable of explaining the apparent contradictions in Christian teachings. It helps us to reconcile the teachings of Jesus that the kingdom of heaven is within us, and his instruction to pray to the Father in heaven. In Vivekananda's view, these teachings were not meant for the same person. So there's no essential contradiction. Now, given Swami Vivekananda's overall view of human religiosity, this evolutionary view that he has, culminating in non-duality, and his understanding of Jesus as a teacher of this truth, it does not surprise us that he gives particular importance to the Gospel of John, and especially to those statements of Jesus that affirm unity with God and the realization of God within. So the two most often cited by him are John 10:30, I and my Father are one, and the Luke 17:21 text, the kingdom of heaven is within you. He interprets I and my Father are one to have the same meaning as the Advaita great sentence Mahavakya, Aham Brahmasmi. So his Christology is shaped decisively by the significance that he gives especially to that single John text. Now, this next point is in the form of a question, is how does he see Jesus? Is Jesus avatar or is Jesus Jivan Mukta? He often cites the Bhagavad Gita, particularly the famous verses from the 4th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, Ajopi sana vyayatma, and so on, yada yada hi dharmasya, to talk about Jesus. But there are several important distinctions or differences that I think are critical here. First, he argues strongly for the multiplicity of divine incarnations against the Christian claim about the singleness and uniqueness of Jesus. So he would say, this is only one example, but he says this many points. The great limitation of Christians is that they do not heed other manifestations of God besides Christ. He was a manifestation of God, so was the Buddha, so were others, and there will be hundreds of others. Do not limit God anywhere, Vivekananda. Second, although employing the traditional terminology of the avatar, Vivekananda's understanding of the doctrine may not be as traditional as the one expounded, by, for example, by a classical Vaishnava theologian like Ramanuja. He speaks more often of the worship of God as a human being in a language that suggests this to be a concession to the human mind than understanding incarnation in very traditional Vaishnavite categories. There are, according to Vivekananda, only two types of human beings who do not worship God as man. He says the brute doesn't worship God as man, and the yogi of the highest kind. Everyone else is constrained to worship God as human, as having a human nature. So I would add very quickly that Vivekananda's epistemological argument places the initiative more on the human side of the equation than on the divine side. And the third and perhaps most important for his Advaita Christology is that Jesus, like the Buddha, represents a state to be attained. In one of his talks, sorry, I went a bit high. Yeah, a state to be attained. A Thousand Island Park lecture he gave this, he states this very clearly. The absolute cannot be worshipped, so we must worship a manifestation, such as Such a one as has our nature. Jesus had our nature. He became the Christ. So can we, and so must we. Christ and the Buddha were names of a state to be attained. Jesus and Gautama were the persons to manifest it. So Jesus became the Christ, Gautama the Buddha. It is the state that is important and not the historical person. The state is universal and eternal, and not the historical particularities of the persons who embody that state. So one of the paramount errors of the Christian tradition in history, according to Vivekananda, is that the messenger became the message. And this is where Christianity, he felt, missed the point. Christians lacked insight to separate the messenger from the message. The messenger did not care to be remembered, but he took center stage, according to Swami Vivekananda. So speaking of Christ as a state, enabled him to challenge and to recast a lot of traditional Christian doctrine, and in particular, the Christian understanding of what the fundamental human problem is. He shifts it from sin to ignorance. And he felt and spoke very strongly that the Christian tradition put too much emphasis on human depravity and sinfulness. And so he shows very minimal interest in doctrines of crucifixion and resurrection or atonement as far as these relate to Jesus. So now I want to conclude quickly with an assessment of this Christology that I tried to at least sketch out in what I've said before. Now, it's very difficult to assess Vivekananda's Christology because whose standpoint you're doing the assessment from the standpoint of the Christian tradition, or perhaps from the standpoint of the Advaita, or from some third location. But I think that in offering an assessment of his Christology, we must clarify the nature of what he's doing, the nature of his reading of the Christian tradition. Now, he doesn't set out to interpret the meaning of the Christian tradition in the manner of a systematic theologian or a biblical scholar. He has a clear sense, he has a clear theology of religions, which is based on this idea of religious evolution from dualism to non-dualism, through which he reads the history of human religiosity, and he applies this to his understanding both of Hindu traditions as well as of non-Hindu traditions. So at the very core of his lens is this belief that religions progress from dualism to panentheism to non-dualism. So from the vantage point of this Advaita theology of religions, he surveys the Christian tradition and interprets it in the light of this evolutionary theology. So what he's offering us is an Advaita view of Christianity that conforms to his understanding of religious history. As one person quite nicely put it, if Christians can speak of an unknown Christ of Hinduism, Hindus can speak of an unknown Vedanta of Christianity. But I think that, and we had a lot of discussion about Vivekananda's inclusivism or his pluralism. I do think that as far as models of theology of religions go, Vivekananda is in many ways an inclusivistic, and I'm not judging that negatively. And while inclusivism has a lot to commend, it's not also exempt from significant problems, and Joseph Prabhu pointed to several of these as well. On the positive side, the inclusivist avoids the condemnation of religions in their entirety, and we see this very clearly in Vivekananda when he says that religions are not moving from error to truth, but from lower truth to higher truth. So the language of the inclusivist is not derogatory in speaking of the other. But on the problematic side, inclusivism speaks of the meaning of another tradition in a language not recognized in the self-understanding of that tradition. And so, even as a Hindu, we'll find it difficult to understand the claim of some Christians that Jesus Christ is the goal and fulfillment of the Hindu religious quest, as many Christian theologians have advocated. Fakwa, famous book, The Crown of Hinduism, speaking about Christianity. Christians, I think, will also find it difficult to see the fulfillment of their religious quest in Advaita. And not only Christians, but Hindu dualists, Madhva, those who follow Madhva or the Vishishta Advaitings of Ramanuja will also question the assumption that their traditions culminate in non-duality, or that, as Vivekananda put it, dualism naturally appeals to less educated minds. You know, you say that to a Vaishnavite theologian or to a follower of Madhva, and it will not go down very well. The second point I want to make on an assessment is that inclusivism also sustains itself through a selective reading of the text of a tradition. And Swami Vivekananda, as I noted before, gives extraordinary importance to two texts. The John 10:30 text, I and my Father one, and the Luke 17:21 text, the kingdom of heaven is within you. On the basis of these two texts, he speaks of Jesus as a teacher of Advaita. It is indeed possible to read these texts as conveying the deepest insights of Advaita tradition, but what do we make of the fact that this is never the way that the Christian tradition has read these, texts? I and my Father one, the John text, is read within the tradition as speaking to the nature of Jesus as incarnation and not as affirming a truth valid for all human beings. So it is not clear to me how the disciples of Jesus, hearing these statements, I and my Father are one, would grasp the meaning of the identity of Atman and Brahman as taught in the Upanishads. If Advaita is the highest teaching of Jesus, I think it is not unreasonable to expect that the textual evidence will be more substantial. It will be clearer. Now, from the Advaita side of the equation, Advaita is both an understanding of the nature of reality as well as a distinctive methodology of instruction about this. And there are two fundamental claims to the Advaita tradition. First is the identity of Atman and Brahman. This is the teaching enunciated in the great Mahavakyas, Tattvamasi, Aham Brahmasmi, Pragyanam Brahma, and so on. But as fundamental as that is the second half of the equation, Sarvam Kalvidam Brahman, that all is Brahman. Without that side of it, Advaita is not complete. And there is no evidence on that side of the equation in the teachings of Jesus. There's absolutely no evidence that he saw the whole of reality as having this non-dual relationship with the divine one. We see no evidence of that. And we see no evidence of a Advaita methodology of teaching in the Gospels. I want to wrap up very quickly. Okay. Or maybe I'm using my time good. Okay. Swami Vivekananda, like Hindu interpreters before and after him, and including Ram Mohan Roy, Keshav Chandra Sen, Gandhi, Radhakrishnan, do not turn to or rely on Christian tradition for an understanding of Jesus. On the other hand, a deliberate effort is made to distinguish and to separate Christ from Christianity. This is an important move among all of these interpreters. And I think this separation is important because this is what allows Swami Vivekananda to interpret Jesus in the categories of Advaita. You have to take him out of the Christian tradition, and then you can read him as teaching Advaita. But while such interpretations can be insightful and enriching, it's also risky. Readings of a tradition by an outsider, bypassing all the rich layers of tradition, may bring fresh and novel perspectives. We have to see that, enabling one to see new and often overlooked dimensions of the tradition. Swami Vivekananda's reading of the 10 of John text in Advaita terms may be one such example of deep insight to the Christian tradition. But at the same time, ignoring or treating a tradition as unnecessary for understanding the meaning of its most important teacher, overlooking the tradition entirely risks offering interpretations that are never recognized as credible within the tradition and have no impact on the tradition's self-understanding of itself. Matters that are important and critical to Christian understanding of Jesus, such as historicity, death, and resurrection, are not given significance. A parallel situation may be a Christian reading of the Upanishads, minus engagement with traditional Advaita teachers, the Acharyas, the Sampradaya. If you try to read Advaita outside of the Sampradaya entirely, as some have done. Abhishektananda and others have done, and which troubled me entirely when I read those. I said, how could you read an Upanishad without reading the Sampradaya in which this Upanishad is understood, where it is preserved, transmitted, and enriched by layers and layers of commentaries. But I think that Swami Vivekananda's Advaita Christology rests fundamentally on a fundamental pillar that was mentioned earlier, because at the heart of what is important in religion to him are not doctrines, dogmas, and theological traditions, but direct self-certifying experience. Religious experience, anubhava. So religious certitude for him will not be found in scriptures and in institutions, but in religious experience. And this is why he sort of speaks of Jesus as the Christ state, which is universally accessible and doesn't need a tradition to make it available and to make it accessible. So it is the firm understanding of religion as essentially mystical experience that explains Swami Vivekananda's disinterest in historical Jesus and in Christian claims for his birth, death, resurrection, etc. Interestingly, the social dimensions of Jesus' teaching did not interest him, unlike Gandhi. Gandhi had a much deeper interest in social teachings of Jesus, but for somehow Vivekananda showed no interest in that dimension. So a few quick comments. I think that there are many critical questions prompted by Swami Vivekananda's Advaita Christology, but I think there's some important insights that I want to leave, although I think that there are many problematic. First, on the Advaita side, it presents the claim that the fundamental insights of the Advaita tradition are available outside of the tradition. He universalizes, or at least makes an attempt to universalize the Advaita tradition in a way that was not done before. Secondly, I think that he's also trying to universalize Jesus, suggesting that there is a distinctive Advaita way of understanding the nature of Jesus that could enrich Christian theological understanding. In other words, universalizing the meaning of Jesus beyond the boundaries of Christianity. Thirdly, I think although Vivekananda may have exaggerated Jesus' otherworldliness and his disinterest in the world, he's reminded to Christians that Jesus gave a message of renunciation, and for him, renunciation was critical to authentic religion, is one that can't be ignored. I think it's a very challenge, a powerful challenge that he presents to the Christian tradition. And finally, I think Vivekananda problematizes rightly Christologies that appear to place limits on God's self-revelation, and we see Christians already responding to this in the outpouring of new theologies of religion. I think the role of Jesus as guru, as teacher, was primary for Vivekananda. In the Christian tradition, Jesus is more significant for who he is and not what he teaches. I think Vivekananda is calling attention to the importance of the teacher as well, and this may be something that might help Christians to recover something of the significance of Jesus as teacher, and who has meaning not only for what he is, but also what he disseminates as a guru, as a teacher. Thank you.
Okay, so the final paper in this panel we've got talking now is Dr. Sharada Sugirtharajah from Birmingham University in the UK. Dr. Sugirtharaja, she's a senior lecturer in Hindu studies, and she taught in India before embarking on her academic career at the University of Birmingham in the mid-1990s. She's also an associate fellow of the School of Oriental and African Studies at SOAS in London, and her research focuses on the representation of Hinduism in colonial and post-colonial writings. In addition to scholarly articles, she's the editor of Religious Pluralism in the Modern World, and also the author of Imagining Hinduism, a Post-Colonial Perspective. And Dr. Sugirtharaja will be talking on Swami Vivekananda and Muscular Hinduism. Thank you.
I would like to thank Rita Sharma for the invitation to speak, to present a paper at this conference, and also would like to thank the sponsors. Can you hear me? Yeah, okay. The previous speakers have been talking about context and that we need to understand Swami Vivekananda in his own context. And I have chosen a particular context which happens to be the colonial context. And I want to see how Vivekananda responded to Western depiction of Hinduism. And it's amazing how the colonized responded to the challenges of his time. And that's what my paper is about. I might have to skip some paragraph because of time, I suppose so. The notion of manly Englishman and the effeminate Bengali was a recurring theme in 19th century colonial discourse and has now become the subject of extensive scholarly discussion in various academic disciplines. Both the colonizer and the colonized produced varied, complex, and ambivalent images of each other and their religious traditions. This paper looks at how the colonized reacted to the colonizers' versions of Hinduism, focusing particularly on how Swami Vivekananda, a 19th century Bengali Hindu monk, responded to colonial and missionary representations of Hinduism as an effeminate religion. In doing so, the paper draws attention to how Swami Vivekananda drew on resources from within and outside the tradition in order to forge a distinctive style of Hinduism, a man-making religion, a robust kind of Vedantic spirituality that combined both physical and spiritual manliness. This model of masculinized Hinduism, masculinized spirituality, became a powerful weapon in his hands to proclaim not only its practicality, but also its universality. First, a brief look at the notion of effeminacy. The notion of Indian effeminacy was widely prevalent in colonial writings in the second half of the 19th century, and particularly with reference to Bengal, the birthplace of Swami Vivekananda, Sri Ramakrishna, Sri Aurobindo, and many other Hindu thinkers. The British portrayal of India as an effeminate nation was largely influenced by their experience in Bengal, despite their awareness of martial races in India. Effeminacy came to be specifically associated with the urban, educated Bengali middle-class Indians, and most of whom were Hindus and who came to be known as Babus. Bengalis were seen as physically, mentally, and morally weak, and what differentiated the Bengali male was the manly, what differentiated the Bengali male from the manly British was his effeminacy. Whatever the case may be, as Sinha points out, whether effeminacy was explained in terms of social or economic factors, or such supposedly scientific factors as climate, biology, the emphasis was inevitably on decline and degeneracy. I may have to speak quiet. Okay. Both Orientalist and missionary perceptions of Hinduism as an effeminate religion have their roots in Victorian notions of masculinity, especially of Christian manliness or manhood, which emerged in 19th century Britain at the height of British imperialism and gained an extraordinary significance in various religious tracts and books, such monographs. I can't mention all those books. These books, such as Christian Manliness, Hints to Young Men, they extolled virtues associated with Christianity, with Christian manliness such as rationality, honesty, loyalty, self-reliance, self-control, discipline, so forth and so on. To put it differently, Christian manliness was defined in opposition, though not always, to qualities deemed to be feminine or effeminate. The establishment of the British Empire was not only seen as an act of divine providence, but also as an act of British masculinity, and that was linked to Christian manliness or manlyhood in the 19th century colonial India. For some 19th century missionaries, not all, for some, Christ served as a model of Christian manliness. And in some instances, Christianity and commerce went in hand in hand. And another thing worth remembering is, in 19th century Orientalist and missionary discourse, religions came to be seen in terms of were classified as muscular religions and non-muscular religions. And Buddhism, Christianity, and Islam were seen as having the vitality and dynamism that the non-missionary religions, which is Brahmanism, Judaism, and Zoroastrianism, were seen to be lacking. It is a missionary character or the muscular character that is seen as raising Christianity above other religions. Christianity, I quote, Christianity's soul, very soul is missionary, progressive, and world-affirming, world-embracing, and that it would cease to exist if it ceased to be missionary, if it disregarded the words of the founder. So it is in this, we need to remember this particular context to understand how Vivekananda was responding to this, and how he produced a kind of a muscular kind of Hinduism. That's what my next step is. In 19th century Orientalist and missionary literature, Hindu effeminacy, among other things, was attributed to Hindu idolatry. The worship of images was seen as a sign of moral degeneration. Most saw Hindu deities as too effeminate, lacking in morality to serve any useful purpose. Hindu incarnations were no more than mere fabrications. Hindu texts were seen as lacking the manly vigor of the Bible. Monia Williams said that. Hindu laws were seen as deficient, riddled with superstitions and theology. Jones, who had a very benevolent attitude to India, nevertheless said this, and Vedic monotheism was too fragile, giving way to polytheism, and this was echoed by Monia Williams, Harold Wilson, including Max Muller. I mean, if you see these scholars, these Orientalists in their own situation, in their own 19th century Protestant context, one would want to say they were extremely liberal from the Christian point of view. But nevertheless, seen from a different standpoint, Hinduism was seen to be very spineless. Religious diversity within the tradition was acknowledged by most Oriental scholars as well as missionaries, but religious diversity was seen as a sign of weakness. In brief, Hinduism lacked a clear monotheistic focus and a sense of order or rationality that characterized Protestant Christianity of that time. So Hindus challenged colonial and missionary critique of Hinduism, but demonstrating that it had a long and glorious history of martial valor, which suffered a temporary setback under foreign rule. Hindus began asserting that there were resources within the tradition that could be summoned in order to offer competing models of masculinity. These models of masculinity, although replicated some features of colonial masculinity, were seen to be a far more superior ideal. Here, as one of our speakers pointed out, this notion of superiority will have to be seen in light of that particular context, whether we are speaking about European scholars or speaking about Indic scholars. So Swami Vivekananda placed a great deal of emphasis on building muscular stamina in order to understand religion. In his address, My Plan of Campaign, delivered in Chennai, or Madras previously known, he called for an affirmation of Kshatriya values, valor and values, to make Hinduism a physically and a spiritually robust religion. I quote, "Make your nerves strong. What we want are muscles of iron and nerves of steel, strength, manhood, Kshatriya, warrior strength. We have wept long enough. No more sweeping, but stand on your feet and be men. It is man-making religion that we want. It is man-making theories we want. It is man-making education we want. And here it is a test of truth. Anything that makes you weak, physically, intellectually, and spiritually, reject as poison." So in his lecture on Vedanta, in its application to Indian life, Vivekananda placed a great degree of emphasis on developing a strong body before one can think of religion. Our young men must be strong. Religion will come afterwards. He remarks, "Be strong, my young friends. That is my advice to you. You will be nearer to heaven through football than through the study of the Gita. You will understand the Gita better with your biceps, your muscles a little stronger. You will understand the mighty genius and the mighty strength of Krishna better with a little of strong blood in you. You will understand the Upanishads better and the glory of the Atman when your body stands firm upon your feet and you feel yourselves as men." Thus, we have to apply these to our needs. But in this particular context, Vivekananda also speaks about the damaging effects of mysticism and urges Hindus to give up weakening mysticisms and embrace the greatest truths embodied in the Upanishads. And there's a quote, I will have to miss that one. If colonial masculinity manifested itself in territorial colonization, the colonized asserted their masculinity in other ways. Vivekananda proclaimed a spirituality that combined both physical and spiritual manliness, the Kshatriya sannyasi, and this has been tackled by other scholars in other disciplines. He infused a robust missionary spirit in Hinduism. If Orientalists spoke about conquering the East with Christianity, Vivekananda spoke about conquering the West with India's Vedantic spirituality. Vedanta, too, like his Western counterparts, uses the language of conquest, not territorial, but spiritual conquest. The cure for Western materialism lay in India's spirituality. Vedantic spirituality, which was seen as effeminate, lacking the muscular strength of Christianity, became a powerful weapon in the hands of Vivekananda to proclaim not only its practicality, but also its universality. In a speech delivered in Triplicane Literary Society in Chennai, he declared, "We must go out, we must conquer the world through our spirituality and philosophy. There is no other alternative. We must do it or die. The only condition of national life, of awakened and vigorous national life, is the conquest of the world by Indian thought." Here is the colonized speaking very powerfully. That's what we need to remember here. Then again, I have to skip a quotation. In defense of Hinduism, Vivekananda proclaimed an action-oriented philosophy. He delivered a series of lectures entitled Practical Vedanta in London, 1896, which can be seen as a kind of response to the Western characterization of the Vedanta as effeminate. See, if you look at closely the writings of Monier Williams and even Max Muller, although towards the end of his life, Vedanta became his salvation, so to speak, you find the notion of effeminacy quite implicit in some places and explicit in certain places. So if Vedanta was seen as a preparation for Christianity, so therefore Vedanta was inadequate in many ways for most Christian scholars. This model of spirituality, in his view, would energize Hindus physically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually, and conquer the world. He affirmed the spiritual manliness of the warrior saint. The Hindu sannyasin is not a passive being, but a karma yogan, a man of action. I have to speak quite. The masculinity of the heroic renunciant was seen as much superior to Western manliness. This spiritual manliness required that men transcend their sexual needs, I suppose even women here, and remain celibate in order to free Mother India. While appreciating Western masculinity, Vivekananda wanted to construct a distinctively Hindu style of masculinity, a masculinity that was not vulnerable in any way. He proclaimed at the Parliament of Religions in 1893 that the Hindu believes that he is spirit, he's a spirit, him the sword cannot pierce, him the fire cannot burn, him the water cannot melt, him the air cannot dry. If missionaries and Orientalists saw muscular Christianity as a cure for what they perceived as effeminate Hinduism, Vivekananda was asserting the superiority of Hindu spiritual manliness. He drew attention to the difference between Christian and Hindu manliness. While Christian manliness is linked with the notion of man as a born sinner, Hindu manliness, in his view, is linked to the notion of man as pure, uncontaminated spirit. I quote, "The Hindu refuses to call you sinners. Come up, O lions, and shake off the delusion that you are sheep, your souls immortal, spirit-free, blessed, and eternal. Ye are not matter, ye are not bodies, neither is your servant, nor you the servant of matter." I close the quote. For Vivekananda, spiritual manliness had to do with purity and not sin. We are called to manifest the divine spirit in us, and spiritual manliness had to do with the recovery and manifestation of the spirit within us, in us. Since the Hindu concept of man is associated, or woman here, both, okay, the Hindu concept of man/woman is associated with the spirit, it is superior to Christian manliness in its view. He was elevating the spiritual and proclaiming it as the essence of true spiritual manliness. Vivekananda was affirming a spiritual masculinity that required control over the physical through brahmacharya or sannyasa. He saw the transformation of sexual energy into spiritual power as beneficial not only to the person concerned, but also to the entire world. Such a person speaks with power, and his words regenerate the world. These are his words. This is not something new, but he placed an extraordinary emphasis on it in order to counteract the colonial stereotype of Bengali as being effeminate. Again, I quote Chowdhury, the rigor implied by sannyas denoted a heroic capacity to bear hardship, undertake penance, and make sacrifices. The roots of Vivekananda's concept of physical manliness can be traced back to the indigenous forms of sport. Participating in sporting activities such as jewelry, club swinging, requires one to practice celibacy, that's brahmacharya, and self-discipline, as well as daily practice. One needs to show respect to their guru. Indian scholars have been keen to establish that there has been a long tradition of physical culture in India. One can look at Majmudar's encyclopedia, which offers a counter-narrative to negative colonial images of Indians. I can't elaborate it here. And Vivekananda also affirmed the masculine through the feminine, the second point I want to make here. While colonialists and missionaries saw Hindu worship of female as deities, worship of female deities as making Hindu men effeminate, Hindu men sought empowerment in their female deities. Bengali Hindus did not give up the worship of the feminine principle. Rather, it became the medium through which they affirmed their manliness and challenged the portrayal of them as effeminate. Deprived of the political power in the public domain, Hindu men began challenging the colonial notion of masculinity by asserting their manliness, not only through male deities such as Krishna and of the Bhagavad Gita, but also through the female warrior deities such as Durga and Kali, known for their martial valor, as well as through heroic female figures such as Lakshmi Bai and others. In fact, the Hindu notion of masculine is closely linked with the feminine principle. Although the equality of male and female is not reflected at the social level, the idea of spiritual equality is found at the philosophical level. If 19th century Victorian missionaries saw the worship of goddess Kali as degrading Hindus, Indian nationalists found in her a source of empowerment. In his lecture on modern India, this is translated from Bengali in 1899, Swami Vivekananda implored the mother goddess to make him manly. O thou mother of the universe, I can't pronounce that word. O thou mother of strength, take away my weakness, take away my unmanliness, and make me a man. So he's imploring a female deity, goddess Kali, to make him a man. How could a Bengali male, the worshipper of the divine feminine power or Shakti, allow himself to be characterized as effeminate and weak? How could a city which derives its name from the goddess Kali produce weak sons? Her brave sons had been stripped of their masculinity under colonial rule. Hindu men asserted the masculinity not by debasing the feminine, as colonialists had done, but by spiritualizing it. In so doing, they were demonstrating that masculinity was superior to Christian manliness. They were keen to demonstrate that the women exhibited superior virtues such as bravery, courage, so forth and so on. And here, I'd rather skip it here. And he was at times very appreciative of Western women for their dedication, for the hard work, for their intelligence. At other times, Vivekananda also speaks about false worship, and so he is not very appreciative at times of Western women's Shakti or whatever. But that said, he had a faithful disciple called Sister Nivedita, as most of you know. Let me just skip. On the one hand, Hindu men asserted the masculinity through divine feminine Shakti, but women were seen as weak. Men were called to be warrior-like and not like women who are quarrelsome. So again, Vivekananda says this in a particular context. Men who manifested feminine traits were seen to be weak. He bemoaned that India had become like a nation of women. He attributed Hindu weakness to the impact of Vaishnava Bhakti. Vaishnavas who valued nonviolence were seen as the threat to masculinized Hinduism. I quote him, though through the preaching of that love broadcast, the nation has become effeminate, a race of women. The whole of Orissa has been turned into a land of cowards, and Bengal has almost lost all sense of manliness, I unquote. It was not merely men. I'm sorry, I'm just not getting my voice because I've been a bit unwell. It was not merely men who were engaged in challenging colonial masculinity. Women too were engaged in constructing a masculinized version of Hinduism. If some 19th century Western missionaries were seen as soldiers of Christ, that's within quotes, on a mission to convert the heathen, Sister Nivedita, an Anglo-Catholic Irish nun, became the disciple of a manly heathen, that is Swami Vivekananda. That's not my quote, okay? And she was on a converse mission of making soldiers of Hindus. She called for a more robust and masculinized Hinduism, as can be seen from the title of a book called Aggressive Hinduism. Let me skip this one, okay. So coming to the conclusion, what I find quite fascinating is, although we were in a colonized state, Vivekananda was able to rise up and engage in a constructive dialogue with the West. He was not anti-West. He borrowed a lot of ideas from the West and integrated into his thinking. At the same time, he wanted to maintain a distinctive style of Eastern spirituality. And this comes out very clearly in one of his addresses, and let me read out that to you. In one of his letters, he wrote to disciples in America, he remarks, "Can you become an Occidental of Occidentals in your spirit of equality, freedom, work, and energy, and at the same time a Hindu to the very backbone in religion, culture, and instinct?" So one can see Vivekananda as challenging Rudyard Kipling's dictum, East is East and West is West, and the twain shall never meet. And to do this whilst being in a position of, while being under subjection, is not an easy task. So I think, and not only that, I think Vivekananda promoted perhaps a kind of a constructive dialogue, and today what we see is some kind of constructive Hinduism that is being forged by Dhanam and by other organizations, and Rita Sharma has done tremendous work wanting to talk about dharmic traditions in a very constructive way. And I think we can look back in that sense to Vivekananda for that kind of a constructive approach. Of course, in any given scholar, whether East or West, we are bound to see tensions, ambivalences, and gaps. And of course, each one of the speeches of Vivekananda will have to be seen in their respective contexts and not be taken out of the context. And as with any identity, as with anything, nothing is static. Our thinking is not static. And our thinking is very much related to the context. As I'm speaking to you, I'm very much relating to the context here. At the same time, being aware that should not be tied to the context.